Howdy, welcome to Howdies, the website where I document my woodworking journey and my many mistakes, mostly made so you can learn from them, of course. Today we're going to do a burned wood epoxy cross. This was actually my very first build. I started with a 4 foot by 1 foot piece of yellow pine. Now you may wonder, yellow pine, why are you building something out of yellow pine? Well, keep in mind that I am going to burn the heck out of it. So I'd rather have something that 1, looks good when it burns, which pine does, and 2, doesn't cost too much. This was the perfect choice. To start, go ahead and cut it down so you've got 2 pieces 24 by 12 inches. There you're going to sketch whatever design you want burned out. In my case, I wanted to do a cross design. Once sketched out, I used a drill to drill the 4 corners. This way, I could cut the remainder of the cross. Using a skill saw, I very carefully and with great skill, cut out the remainder of the outline of the cross. This is eventually going to be filled with epoxy. Next, it's time to burn, baby, burn. To burn the wood, I used a propane torch that I bought from my local Harbor Freight store. It actually worked out great, exactly how I needed it. Simply connect it to a propane tank, turn the nozzle, and light it up. For safety purposes, and just out of the shot, I had a bucket of water as well as a hose that was turned on and ready to go in case the fire got out of control. You'll notice as I was burning it, a drop of propane actually fell onto the wood itself. Good to know that these things might leak propane. No worries, I knew I was going to burn it completely charred and it would go away. As you're burning your wood, make sure to do it a little bit on each side and flip every once in a while. This makes sure that the wood does not crack or warp. It also makes sure that you get a good even burn throughout your piece. One thing I noticed while doing this was the knots do not burn as easily as the rest of the wood, so you're probably going to have to spend a little bit more time on them at the end. One interesting thing is, as much as I burn this piece, and you're watching it here, it still only burned maybe 1/16 to 1/8 inch into the wood itself. And it still gave me that great design that I wanted. Here you see the final burn. I think it's ready for the epoxy. For the epoxy, the first thing you want to do is do a layer to make sure that you don't get any bubbles once you do your top coat, or once you do one of the fill coats. I tried to paint it on, and one of the mistakes I made was rushing this. In fact, you probably want to do multiple coats. As you'll see later, I had bubble issues. Another issue I found out was that the propane torch I was using to try and pop the bubbles did not work. It was not made to be inverted, and every time I turned it upside down, it turned off. While a lighter worked, it is certainly not the best choice. After another trip to my local hardware store, I found a much better top by Benzomatic. Here, as you can see, it's specifically made to be used inverted. As I test it out, you can see that it works upside down in all different directions. It even has a lock button in case I want to lock it and then accidentally drop it. It'll keep burning things on the ground. Probably not going to use that very often. I put the piece into a mold that I bought online. I actually got it from Etsy, and I'll put a link to the seller at the bottom of the description. The mold itself is 12 inches by 24 inches, so it fit my piece perfectly. I used a pigment by Eye Candy called Soma as my white. I wanted something that was somewhat see-through, but really just a pretty white that would fill the middle of it. My intent was that I was simply going to fill around the edges and then also going to fill the cross center part as well with this particular Soma white. Unfortunately, my clumsy pouring got all over the piece instead. So I figured, maybe I'll scrape some of that off. As you can see, the scraping didn't work real well. Even the dabbing did not get all of the excess Soma epoxy off. So my final piece has a little more shine to it than I wanted. But in the end, I think it worked out well. As you're trying to fix this mistake, remember that when you unclamp your piece and you've already poured the epoxy in it, the wood is going to float. It's going to come to the top. Another thing that you'll notice is when I clamped it down, I used a couple small pieces of HDPE. Well, where the epoxy touched the HDPE, it created a glassy part. You'll see that in a little bit. I had to change my design of this. Originally, it was going to be a serving tray, but when I had to cut the two edges off for the shiny parts, I decided to go ahead and turn it into wall art. Here you can see the final piece getting ready for the top coat. And here you can see what I was talking about, the glossy part where the HDPE was clamped on to the wood. Even scratching it with my finger wouldn't make it go away. Okay, on to the top coat. Mixing up another batch of epoxy, I coated the entire piece on the top after the other had already hardened. Again, I used the torch to make sure that there were no bubbles, or at least I thought that there were no bubbles. Here's where we go back. Remember when I said make sure you do more than one coat to solidify the piece? Yeah, I didn't do that. So as you can see, I got multiple bubbles. And surprisingly, even pouring more epoxy on afterwards didn't fix it. The next step was to remove the piece from the mold. I used a rubber hammer and simply tapped around the sides until you hear that distinctive cracking noise. No, that doesn't mean you've destroyed it. It means you've just got the sides to be released from the edge. Tapping gently on the back, like we're told to do, didn't do anything. Yeah, it was still stuck in there really well. So I decided, let's do what normally we do whenever we can't get something to work. I'm going to flip it over, I'm going to put something soft down on the ground, and I'm going to slam it down a couple times. That'll work. Oh, hey, it actually did work. So this is the back of the piece. I'm not too worried about the little holes in the back. On to sanding. Yes, that was real lightning and real thunder. Even God does not like to sand. After sanding and sanding and sanding and sanding and sanding, I finally got to the point where it was somewhat flat. After blowing the piece off, I got a good idea of where the holes were on the front side. To try and correct them, what I thought I would do is try and drill them out. Certainly if I drill it out and then clean out the little holes, I can refill the bubbles with epoxy and you won't see it, right? The theory was sound. Perhaps the execution wasn't quite as good as it should have been. Blow out the holes, make sure it's as clean as it can be, and then using a syringe, I tried to fill the bubbles. The problem was my syringe was too fat, and when I put it in there, the bubbles remained underneath the epoxy. The torch helped, some, but there were still some bubbles. Luckily, in my final piece, they were mostly covered. Time to sand again, and sand, and sand. Hey, look, I got this really cool design. That means I probably should have switched the paper from what I learned later. A good dousing with a hose helped me get all the remaining residue off. And of course I forgot to film it, but I used a 1/4 round and my router to put a soft quarter round edge all the way around the piece, both front and back. Next was for the finish. A number of coats of polyurethane, and yes, I finished both the front and the back. I actually used the back as a test to see if it would work. Once it worked, I went ahead and used the front. Yes, I'm doing multiple coats, and since my garage was not lit at this point, I'm doing this probably in the middle of the night and using a flashlight. As you can see though, the polyurethane worked great. To close the piece out, I cut the top and the bottom parts off, and I added a black strip of wood and a hanger in the back so that it would hang properly on the wall. Hope you enjoyed the build. On to my next project.